Welcome back. We're discussing the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. With me in the studio is Cohen, the former director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean office in Washington. Isaac, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, as we know, the debt in Puerto Rico is now standing at $72 billion. Puerto Rico has made an appeal to the U.S. Congress for some help. There is some legislation in the pipeline right now in the Senate. Is it likely it will get that help from the United States?
Well, I think they're going to have to do something because Puerto Rico, by the fact that it's not a state of the Union, does not have access to bankruptcy courts in the United States. Consequently, one of the problems precisely is that, if you want to come to an agreement or try to fix the situation one way or the other, it would be preferable if they would have access to the U.S. court system. Because there are procedures that already exist, that can be applied to a situation like that. Like we saw it in the case of Detroit, right, where Detroit went bankrupt. And they went to a federal judge who decided, well, how many assets do you have and who is going to be paid and how much, which is what a bankruptcy procedure is in the end. So I think that the hope is that there is a solution in Congress because Puerto Rico doesn't have access to the U.S. courts.
So in effect, what would happen if this legislation does get through is that Puerto Rico will get access to the courts, it would be able to file for bankruptcy and then restructure its debt?
Correct. Yeah, they would have to program, reschedule the whole thing and make it possible for them to pay. Because I don't think they're saying they don't want to pay. What they're saying is they need to restructure. They need to reschedule the whole thing. And so I guess that's the right thing. The issue at some point is going to have to be, okay, how do you make the Puerto Rican economy grow? Because that's at the bottom, at the source of the problem is precisely the fact that the Puerto Rican economy hasn't been growing for a long time, for about a decade,
Right. Puerto Rico depends a lot on tourism for its economy.
Correct.
Is that being affected right now?
Well, not much. The fact is that Puerto Rico was very successful in attracting the chemical industry in the United States. Pharmaceutical companies went because they got special incentives and went to settle in Puerto Rico. Most of the medicines that we consumed in the U.S., in the continent, were produced in Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, that program was terminated, and now the industries are no longer going to Puerto Rico. So now you have a reverse situation. Since the island is not growing enough and it's not attracting enough foreign investment, then what's happening is that Puerto Ricans are leaving. Some of them are going to Florida, and the weather is the same, and they are U.S. citizens after all. And the only thing is that when they move to the mainland, they have to pay federal taxes, which they do not when they're leaving the island.
And a lot of them are leaving, something like $50,000 a year leaving right now. Absolutely.
It's amazing. In the area in Florida, right now they're becoming a more significant minority than the Cuban minority already. So that's a big change for Florida as well.
That just shows you how many are leaving. Now, does Puerto Rico have access to money elsewhere, apart from the United States? Can it get money from other countries?
Well, not exactly, because Puerto Rico had the privilege of having access to the U.S. capital market.
Right.
It enjoyed the best ratings in the U.S. for a long time. And their municipal bonds were considered the best kind of investment. And you wouldn't pay taxes if you bought a Puerto Rican bond. Which was very attractive.
Well, that's what happened. All the middle class in America were investing their money in municipal bonds, not paying taxes, thinking they're going to get a good return on this.
There you are. And Puerto Rico was classified AAA. So, in the U.S., certain hedge funds and pension funds they are not allowed to invest in paper that is not highly graded. Consequently, Puerto Rico was very attractive. And they enjoyed this access to the U.S. capital market, which was a privilege. Unfortunately, the economy started, as I said, not growing for a long period of time. And debts, continued increasing, at the same time. So now you have this situation where the governor declared, that they cannot pay. But that doesn't mean they don't want to pay. That only means that they want to have to reschedule. If they would be able to come to the U.S. courts, I'll go back to that point, it would be very simple. You know, you go to court, the judge says, okay, this is what you have, this is what you owe, we're going to pay these guys this much, and that's it.
When we look at the economy in Puerto Rico, and as you've just pointed out, the economy has not been growing. I mean, is there a failure on the part of the Puerto Ricans here to invest in public works projects, social services, that would have expanded the economy, that would have generated more money?
Yes, probably the key was to attract investment, as they were doing with the pharmaceuticals. They were very good at attracting the pharmaceutical industry. It was amazing. It was really a sustained economic growth in Puerto Rico because of the incoming investments from the pharmaceutical industry and the exports to the mainland. Because Puerto Rico has the privilege of having access to the biggest market in the world, you know, which is the US. But unfortunately, when those incentives that were given to the pharmaceuticals were terminated, there was no alternative model for attracting foreign investment that replaced that. And consequently, the economy started declining. So you need to have, as the governor said it very well, he said, we need to reschedule the debt, but we also need a development plan. So they need to figure out, tourism is one of the sectors that is very important, but they need to attract foreign investment as well in other sectors.
And do you think they'll get a more sympathetic hearing in Congress if they come up with a viable development plan to bring to Congress and say, look, here's what we're going to do. We need this restructured. We need access to the courts in the United States so we can legally restructure our debt.
Sure. I think they may get a favorable treatment in Congress. That's a possibility. I hope it'll work. But there is also the possibility that some of the debt from Puerto Rican debt is from the government. Other part of the debt is from the public utilities that have their own revenue. For instance, the power company. Now, there was a discussion whereby they were going to separate the debt that comes out of the utilities, because the utilities have their own revenue. So they can promise, you know, they can use the revenue to pay. So the idea was to try to get these public companies to be able to come to court in the United States. Instead of having the whole government, the whole package come, break the package in pieces and bring in the utilities which have their own revenue and try to solve the problem. So like that, you would probably reduce the size of the problem, you know.
What's the alternative? If there's no bailout, if there's no restructuring, what happens then?
Well, it's just a default, where you say, I cannot pay. You know, and then there's going to be a negotiation with the creditors, where Puerto Rico is going to say, listen, for a bond that was worth 100, I'm going to pay you 5 cents or whatever, you know. So it's very critical. I think that should be avoided. That's an extreme alternative. I think it's good that you pointed that out, because that's the risk, you know, that you get into a situation where everybody loses, which you don't want to.
Right, and of course now time is of essence right now.
Absolutely, because the Congress can solve that very quickly, you know, particularly if they break down this thing by getting the utilities to come and try to solve the problem of the utilities, because that's about half of the debt is owed by the utilities. And once you have a revenue, you can pay, you see.
Have we seen a serious cutback in services, public services for ordinary Puerto Ricans?
Well, definitely I think the government has been curtailing investment, and that is probably hurting already the population. There have been drastic measures also. Hiring by the government has been reduced, and the economy is hurting from that. Because on top of the fact that you have a recession, you have the government retrenching and reducing expenditure, you know, and that doesn't help the economy. So you have like a vicious circle there that you have to break somewhere.
Right, so your capacity is reduced all the time.
Absolutely.
Cohen, thank you very much for joining us, sir.